Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now, let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. From the outside, Kenechukwu Keen Abadike and Kayamaka Okoye were the kind of couple that made people believe in love again. At 32, Keen was already a successful real estate developer. His name tied to some of the most admired properties in Enugu and Abuja. He carried himself with the calm assurance of a man who had worked his way up from almost nothing. Kayamaka, on the other hand, seemed born for the spotlight, tall, graceful, and effortlessly charming, with a smile that could soften the sternest faces. Together, they were photographed at charity galas, Sunday brunches, and even impromptu roadside markets where they bought fruit from grateful sellers who later gushed on Facebook about the encounter. In public, their fingers were always intertwined, their laughter timed perfectly, their gazes filled with the kind of warmth that made onlookers sigh. Yet if anyone looked closer, really looked, they might have noticed that Kayamaka's gaze often flickered away too quickly, or that her smile seemed just a shade too deliberate when Keen spoke about dreams that didn't involve luxury vacations or high-end brands. Keen's friends envied him, calling him the luckiest man alive for finding such beauty and grace. His family adored Kayamaka. His mother loved to say she was an answer to prayer and the daughter she never had. Still, there were subtle undercurrents. Kayamaka's mother, Madame Rose, was a constant presence, always advising, always suggesting, always nudging decisions toward what she called the more sensible option, which, coincidentally, often involved higher spending or more grandeur. Madame Rose had a way of speaking in sweet tones that somehow left Keen with no room to object. And while Keen had noticed her influence, he told himself that it was harmless. After all, every mother wanted the best for her daughter. It wasn't until later that he would realize best was a word Madame Rose defined very differently from him. In private moments, when the cameras were gone and the public eyes turned elsewhere, Kayamaka sometimes let slip her impatience. She would complain about Keen's business trips being too long or his insistence on personally visiting his building sites instead of sending staff. "You have people for that, baby," she would say, lounging on the sofa in silk pajamas while scrolling through luxury brand catalogs on her phone. Keen would laugh it off, telling himself she simply wasn't used to the grind he had known growing up. He believed her love was real, even if her dreams revolved around soft things and expensive places. It was that belief, his certainty in the story they were telling the world, that would later make the cracks in their foundation feel like a betrayal that reached into his bones. It was a Thursday evening, and Keen had just taken Kayamaka to one of her favorite rooftop restaurants overlooking the city. The warm harmattan breeze made the night feel almost magical, the string lights above their table casting a soft glow on her face. They were halfway through a shared plate of suya and grilled vegetables when she suddenly went pale. Her fork clattered against the plate, her body slumping forward before Keen could catch her. "Kayamaka," he called, panic flooding his voice as he rushed to her side. Within seconds, other diners were on their feet, and someone was calling for an ambulance. Keen held her hand the entire way to the hospital, his mind racing through every terrifying possibility. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity of tests, a doctor in a white coat entered the private waiting area with a grave expression. "Mr. Abadike," he began, "your fiancée has a rare kidney condition, stage 4. She needs a transplant urgently if she's to survive beyond the next few months." The words struck Keen like cold steel. He barely heard the rest of the explanation, except for one detail. They would need to check for a compatible donor immediately. Without hesitation, Keen insisted on being tested. When the results came back later that night showing he was a perfect match, relief mixed with determination settled in his chest. To him, there was no question. He would give her the kidney. She was his future, his partner, his love. Saving her life was not a sacrifice. It was the most natural choice in the world. Kayamaka's tears when he told her his decision only deepened his resolve. She clung to him, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I don't deserve you." He kissed her forehead, telling her there was nothing to deserve. It was simply what you did for the person you planned to spend your life with. In that moment, he felt like a hero. The doctors began scheduling the necessary pre-surgery tests, and hospital staff were instructed to give her VIP treatment. Keene made all the arrangements without complaint, using his connections to ensure she would get the best care possible. He had no idea then that the woman whose life he was about to save was building a plan that would end his. Madame Rose arrived at the hospital the following morning wearing a somber expression and carrying a small Bible in one hand. Her eyes glistened with what appeared to be genuine gratitude as she took Keene's hand in hers. "My son," she began in a trembling voice, "God bless you for what you are doing for my daughter. Many men would run away, but you are a real man." She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her tone shifting from soft to urgent. "Please, do not delay. The sooner the surgery is done, the better her chances. She's so young, Keene. She hasn't even given you children yet." Her words, though framed as concern, carried an edge, a subtle push toward action, without hesitation. Keene's own family, particularly his mother and two sisters, echoed similar sentiments when they visited later that day. They praised his selflessness, calling it an act of true love. His best friend, Tobe, however, wasn't as quick to applaud. Over a quiet coffee in the hospital cafeteria, Tobe asked carefully, "Are you sure about this? I'm not saying don't do it, but have you noticed how quickly everyone is pushing you to decide?" Keene frowned, but brushed it off. He believed this was simply the urgency of a medical crisis. Still, a small seed of unease settled somewhere deep inside him. By the end of the week, the hospital had scheduled the surgery for the following month. Kayamika's health appeared stable for now, but the doctors emphasized that delaying too long could lead to complications. Madame Rose seemed to take personal responsibility for reminding Keene of this fact every time she saw him. "We must act quickly, my son," she would repeat, squeezing his arm as though sealing a pact. Keene interpreted her persistence as a mother's desperation, never suspecting that urgency could be a weapon in the wrong hands. At that stage, he was too wrapped in his own conviction that love was worth any price, even if the price was a part of himself. The call from Keene's lawyer came late in the afternoon while he was seated in Kayamika's hospital room, watching her sleep. The lawyer's voice was formal but carried an undertone of urgency. "Keene, I must remind you that your father's will contains a clause you have not yet fulfilled. If you are not married before December 31st, a substantial portion of your inheritance will be redirected to the Abedijk Foundation for Public Housing." The will had always been a strange point for Keene. His father had been a generous man, but also a strict one, believing that marriage grounded a man and kept him responsible. "That's still months away," Keene replied, but the lawyer's follow-up was unsettling, given the circumstances, and if surgery recovery takes time, you may wish to move the wedding forward. Keene's eyes instinctively drifted to Kayamika, her delicate form lying against crisp white sheets, and his chest tightened. Marrying her sooner made sense. If she was going to face a long recovery, it would be as his wife. The thought of her not making it to that day filled him with dread, and the inheritance clause suddenly became more than just a legal technicality. It was a reason to solidify their future before uncertainty could snatch it away. When he broached the topic with Kayamika later that evening, she reacted with surprising enthusiasm. Her eyes lit up, and she gripped his hand tightly. "Why wait, Keene? We've already planned a life together. Imagine, after the surgery, we could have our wedding and a honeymoon to celebrate our second chance at life." She spoke with a bright eagerness that made Keene feel guilty for hesitating at all. Madame Rose, who was standing by the window pretending to scroll through her phone, chimed in without missing a beat. "It's the perfect idea. It will give Kayamika the strength she needs to recover quickly. Nothing heals the body like knowing love is waiting at the altar." Her words were wrapped in warmth, but there was an odd glint in her eyes, one Keene dismissed as a mother's joy at her daughter's good fortune. He told himself she simply wanted to see her child married and secure before fate could throw another cruel twist. Within days, Madame Rose had taken charge of the wedding arrangements, as though the date was already fixed. She called planners, priced venues, and even suggested outfits, telling Keene they could manage most of the work while Kayamika rested. He appreciated her initiative, After all, he was juggling work, hospital visits, and his own pre-surgery tests. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that everything seemed to be moving with a force and speed that wasn't entirely about love. He ignored it. He told himself that sometimes the universe simply aligned events in a way that made decisions clear. What he didn't realize was that the speed wasn't cosmic luck. It was calculated urgency designed to trap him in a commitment before he had time to see through the smiles. The engagement party was held in one of Enugu's most luxurious hotel ballrooms, a space dripping with gold accents, chandeliers, and the hum of soft jazz. Keene spared no expense, determined to make it a night Kayamika would remember, if for nothing else than the proof that his love knew no limits. Kayamika arrived in a floor-length emerald gown that shimmered under the lights, her arm linked with his as camera flashes followed them from the entrance. Madame Rose played the gracious hostess, floating from table to table, ensuring every guest felt personally welcomed. Laughter bubbled through the room, toasts were made, and even Tobe, who had been skeptical, admitted that perhaps Keene's love story was indeed as perfect as it seemed. Keene soaked in the warmth of the evening, letting the energy of well-wishers drown out the small doubts Tobe had planted weeks ago. It was midway through the night, as Keene stepped away from the dance floor to take a call, that it happened. A man middle-aged, wearing a simple brown suit, approached him with an urgency that cut through the celebratory atmosphere. "Are you Keene Abedike?" he asked in a low voice. Keene nodded, expecting perhaps a business acquaintance or a distant relative. Instead, the man leaned closer, his breath heavy with the scent of palm wine. "That woman, the one you're about to marry, she is not who she seems. Don't give her what she's asking for. It will be the last thing you do." Before Keene could react, the man melted back into the crowd, disappearing among the guests, as though he'd never been there. Keene's first instinct was disbelief. This was his engagement party, for heaven's sake. Who would come here to whisper poison into his ear? And yet, the man's tone hadn't been the playful warning of a jealous ex or a bitter acquaintance. It had been dead serious. He searched the room for the stranger, but the hotel was filled with people he didn't know personally, friends of friends, associates of Madame Rose, even a few political figures. Kayamika noticed his distracted expression when he returned to her side. "What's wrong, love?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. He forced a smile and shook his head, unwilling to ruin the night with vague accusations. But the seed had been planted. Later, as the party wound down and they posed for their last photographs, Keene caught Madame Rose speaking quietly to a man in a brown suit near the exit, though when he blinked, the man was gone again. That night, as he lay in bed, the stranger's warning echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. The days following the engagement party were a blur of medical tests, consultations, and whispered conversations in hospital corridors. Kayamika had been admitted for closer monitoring, and Madame Rose moved into the private suite with her, ensuring that everything, from meals to floral arrangements, was perfect for recovery. Keene divided his time between work and the hospital, often arriving to find Madame Rose already there, adjusting pillows or chatting with nurses as though she were managing a hotel rather than a place of healing. Kayamika herself seemed in better spirits than before, her cheeks flushed with a healthy glow that didn't match the image of a woman in critical need of a transplant. When Keene mentioned it, she laughed softly. "Love is the best medicine," she said, brushing the topic aside. But there were small things that began to gnaw at him. Her phone never left her side, and whenever a message came in, she would tilt the screen away before answering. Sometimes she would excuse herself to take calls in the hallway, returning with the faint scent of a perfume he didn't recognize. When Keene teased her about her mystery conversations, she would kiss his cheek and say they were just her girlfriends checking in on her. Madame Rose, for her part, deflected any suspicion by smothering Keene with gratitude, constantly reminding him of how heroic his decision was and how much the family loved him for it. The constant praise felt both reassuring and oddly suffocating. One afternoon, as he walked into the room unannounced, Keene caught the tail end of a sentence from Kayamika to her mother, not wanting to wait until after the surgery to start the next plan. Both women froze when they saw him, and Madame Rose was quick to smile. "We were just talking about wedding plans," she explained smoothly, her voice light. Keen nodded, though the unease that had been growing since the engagement party now deepened. The words had been vague, but the way they had both reacted, like children caught with hands in a cookie jar, told him there was more to the conversation than table decorations or flower arrangements. He left the room that day with a polite smile on his face, but inside, the first real threads of suspicion began to weave into something darker. The following week, Keen's schedule became a careful dance between hospital visits, managing his real estate projects, and attending preliminary meetings with the surgeon who would perform the transplant. Kayamika's condition, while serious on paper, showed no outward signs of decline. If anything, she seemed more vibrant, often found scrolling through luxury wedding ideas on her phone or chatting animatedly with her mother. One Tuesday afternoon, Keen returned to the hospital after a long site inspection, planning to surprise Kayamika with her favorite pineapple parfait from a high-end cafe. As he approached the room, voices drifted through the slightly ajar door. It was Madame Rose's sharp tone that first caught his attention. "We can't wait until after the surgery to start the next plan," she said, her voice firm, almost impatient. Kayamika's reply came softer, but still audible. "I know, Mama, but if we rush, it could draw suspicion." The words rooted Keen to the spot. Next plan? What next plan could possibly matter more than her health? He wanted to barge in, demand an explanation, but the rational side of him told him not to jump to conclusions. When he pushed the door open seconds later, both women reacted with subtle startlement that they tried to hide. Madame Rose quickly stood, smoothing her wrapper, her voice switching to an airy tone. "Keen, my son, we were just talking about the wedding plans," she said, using the same excuse she had before. Kayamika gave a small, rehearsed smile, asking about the parfait in his hand as though the previous conversation had never happened. The moment felt staged, like walking into a theater scene mid-performance. Keen forced himself to play along, handing over the dessert while masking his unease. He told himself it was unfair to suspect them. Wedding planning could easily sound secretive if overheard out of context. Yet the echo of Madame Rose's impatient tone lingered in his mind, pressing against the fragile trust he had always placed in Kayamika. That night, as Keen lay in bed, he replayed the incident over and over. He imagined possible explanations. Maybe they were referring to honeymoon arrangements or a surprise party, or even discussing how to manage press coverage after the surgery. Still, something about the way Madame Rose had said "we can't wait" gnawed at him, like a splinter lodged deep beneath the skin. Keen wasn't a naturally suspicious man. He preferred to trust until given undeniable reason not to. But the shadows in Kayamika's recent behavior, the secret calls, the guarded expressions, the strange urgency, were beginning to form a pattern, and his instincts, honed from years of business negotiations, whispered that patterns meant plans. And plans, if not shared, often meant trouble. By the time Friday arrived, Tobe had had enough of watching his best friend plunge headfirst into what he suspected was a trap. Sitting across from Keen in a small cafe near the hospital, Tobe leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Keen, I'm telling you something's off. You've been so focused on saving her life that you're ignoring the red flags waving in your face." Keen bristled, half tempted to end the conversation, but Tobe's next words stopped him cold. "I followed her yesterday after she told you she was too tired for visitors." Keen stared at him, shock flooding his expression. "Followed her?" Tobe nodded grimly. "She didn't go home. She didn't go anywhere near the pharmacy like she claimed. She went to a boutique downtown, one of those places that doesn't even display price tags. And she wasn't alone." Tobe described how he had watched from across the street as Kayamika stepped out of a black SUV with an older man, tall, well-dressed, and instantly recognizable to anyone who followed local politics. Senator Ofogbu. Keen knew the name, knew the face, and knew the man's reputation for charm and ambition. According to Tobe, the two had walked into the boutique together, laughing, their hands brushing in ways that went far beyond casual familiarity. At one point, the senator had leaned in close, his hand resting at the small of her back as she showed him a pair of diamond earrings. "I thought maybe it was business," Tobe continued, until I saw him kiss her hand before they left. This isn't a casual acquaintance, Keen. You need to open your eyes. Keen wanted to dismiss the story, to accuse Tobe of exaggeration or misunderstanding. Yet a slow, heavy unease began to coil in his stomach. Why hadn't Kayamika mentioned the meeting? Why lie about being too tired to see him? Still, part of him clung stubbornly to hope. Hope that there was a reasonable explanation, that Tobe had misread the situation, that his fiancée wasn't betraying him in the most intimate way possible. But the other part of him, the one that had started noticing the inconsistencies, began to prepare for the possibility that love had blinded him to something dangerous. He didn't know it yet, but within days, all doubts would be obliterated, not by speculation, but by the cruel clarity of overheard truth. It happened on a humid Monday morning, the kind where the hospital's air conditioning felt like a blessing. Keen had arrived early for a meeting with the surgeon to finalize the transplant date. As he walked down the quiet garden corridor adjacent to the private suites, voices drifted through the air, low, conspiratorial, and chillingly familiar. He slowed his steps, instinctively keeping to the shaded path until the words became clear. It was Madame Rose speaking, her tone stripped of the sugar-coated warmth she used with him. Once he donates the kidney, we'll slowly poison him with the medication so you can marry that senator, she said, the words as casual as discussing weekend plans. Keen froze, the blood in his veins turning to ice. Then Kayamika's laugh followed, soft, triumphant, and utterly foreign to the woman he thought he knew. I already got a house deed in my name, she replied, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Keen's first instinct was disbelief. Surely he had misheard, misinterpreted. But the confidence in their voices, the ease with which they discussed ending his life, left no room for misunderstanding. His chest tightened, each heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had been prepared to give her a part of himself, to risk his health and possibly his future, for love, and she had been preparing to kill him for convenience. He felt like a man watching a carefully built home crumble in seconds, every brick a memory that now cut like glass. The temptation to storm in, to confront them right then and there, surged hot in his blood. But years in business had taught him that timing was everything, and a premature move could mean losing the upper hand forever. Swallowing his rage, Keen stepped back, retracing his steps silently until the voices faded. His breathing was heavy, controlled only by the sheer force of will it took not to explode. By the time he reached the main hospital wing, a plan had already begun to take shape. He would not confront them now. He would not even let them suspect he knew. Instead, he would pretend, play the part of the loving, oblivious fiancé, give them the illusion of safety. And then, when the time was right, he would strip away that safety in a way they could never recover from. The kidney he had once intended to give as a gift of love would now become the bait in a trap they would never forget. When Keen walked back into Kayamika's hospital room later that morning, his expression was the same as it had been countless times before, calm, affectionate, and reassuring. She was sitting up in bed, scrolling through her phone, while Madame Rose arranged a bouquet of roses on the side table. "You're back early," Kayamika said, setting her phone down with a smile that now looked different to Keen, not warmer or colder, but calculated. In that instant, every glance, every smile, every touch over the past year seemed to rearrange themselves into a picture he had never wanted to see. Still, he returned the smile, placing a small shopping bag on her lap. "Thought you'd like these," he said, revealing a silk scarf she had admired weeks ago. Kayamika's eyes lit up, and she leaned in to kiss him. He let her, though the contact felt like ice against his skin. Inside, his mind was replaying the words he had overheard in the garden corridor, branding them onto his soul like fire. For the rest of the day, he played the part of the devoted fiancé perfectly. He talked about the surgery as though nothing had changed, asked about her comfort, even discussed wedding details with Madame Rose, who seemed particularly pleased with herself. Every time either of them spoke, he felt a sharp mix of anger and fascination. Anger at their audacity, fascination at how skillfully they concealed malice beneath layers of charm. Yet Keen knew better than to act on raw emotion. His father had taught him that in business and in life, Revenge was a dish that required preparation. He resolved, in that quiet space between their words, that he would not only protect himself, but also destroy whatever illusion of control they thought they had. By evening, he had excused himself, claiming he needed to finalize property contracts before the surgery. In reality, he returned to his office, sat at his desk, and began sketching out a plan on a blank sheet of paper. At the top, he wrote one word in bold letters: proof. If he confronted them now, they would deny it, twist the narrative, perhaps even convince others that stress or paranoia was clouding his judgment. No, he needed undeniable evidence, something that would crush them under the weight of their own words. And for that, he would need help from the one person who had never doubted him, Tobe. The next morning, Keene returned to the hospital with a subtle change in his demeanor. He moved slower, spoke softer, and let his shoulders sag just enough to suggest fatigue. Kayamika's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite name. Was it concern or the satisfaction of seeing him vulnerable? Madame Rose fussed over him immediately, urging him to sit, offering him tea, and asking if he was getting enough rest. "You're doing too much for my daughter," she said, her voice dripping with maternal warmth. "You need to save your strength for the surgery." Keene nodded, murmuring that he was fine, while inside he marveled at how easy it was to feed their sense of control. If they believed he was weakening physically and emotionally, they would be more careless, more confident in their victory. He subtly began planting seeds of inconvenience, telling them the surgery date might have to shift due to hospital policy changes and new donor evaluation steps. Madame Rose reacted sharply the first time he mentioned it, but quickly masked her frustration, agreeing that the hospital knows best. Keene noticed the way her jaw tightened whenever delays were discussed, and it confirmed what he already knew. They wanted this surgery completed as soon as possible, not for Kayamika's health, but to move forward with their real plan. The more he pretended to hesitate, the more they pressed him to recommit, giving him opportunities to observe their reactions. By the end of the week, Keene had successfully crafted the image of a man too weary to question anything. Kayamika started calling the shots in conversations, making suggestions about post-surgery honeymoon destinations, and casually dropping remarks about how much life will change once they were married. He played along, nodding and smiling, letting her believe he was surrendering to her vision. But when he left the hospital each evening, he became someone else entirely, a man mapping out the details of a takedown. It was during one of these late-night planning sessions with Tobe that the next phase took shape. They would begin recording everything. Tobe didn't need convincing when Keene told him the truth about what he'd overheard. His friend's jaw tightened with controlled fury. "We'll get them," Tobe said simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. They began by purchasing discreet audio recorders small enough to fit into the lining of gift boxes and flower vases. Keene delivered these to Kayamika's hospital room under the guise of thoughtful gestures: a jewelry box for her engagement ring, a new vase for the constant stream of flowers. Madame Rose even thanked him for his attention to detail, completely unaware that every conversation in the room was now being captured in high clarity. Over the next several days, the recordings began to reveal everything Keene had suspected and more. There were discussions about selling one of his properties once things were settled, arguments over which of them would handle the senator's financial gifts, and repeated references to how his death will need to look natural. One recording in particular chilled Keene to the bone. Madame Rose detailing the medication schedule they would use to weaken him gradually. The casualness in her tone made his stomach turn. She was speaking about ending a man's life as if she were discussing a menu. Keene kept each file carefully labeled and backed up, knowing that the more evidence he had, the more devastating the final blow would be. Still, there was one piece missing: proof of the senator's direct involvement. Without it, the exposure would hurt Kayamika and Madame Rose, but might leave the senator room to distance himself. That's when Keene remembered Afani, his tech-savvy cousin with a talent for intercepting phone calls and messages. If they could catch Kayamika speaking to the senator about the plan, everything would fall into place. And with that, the final stage of his trap began to unfold. With the hospital room fully bugged, Keen already had enough evidence to expose Kayamika and Madame Rose, but the missing link, the senator, remained crucial. Without tying him directly to their plan, the man could deny everything and walk away clean, leaving Keen's enemies with a powerful ally. That's where Ifani came in. His younger cousin had a reputation in their family for knowing how to find things, and while most relatives assumed this meant business leads, Keen knew it also included more unconventional skills. One quiet evening at Keen's office, he slid his phone across the table to Ifani and explained the situation in clipped, precise terms. Ifani didn't flinch. "So you want his voice clear as day," he said. Keen nodded. "Better still, his face, but I'll take the voice." Ifani's grin was quick and sharp. "Leave it to me." Over the next week, Ifani monitored Kayamika's calls using a combination of software and physical interception. When Keen handed her a new luxury phone as a surprise gift, she didn't know it was pre-loaded with monitoring tools. On a humid Thursday morning, the breakthrough came. Kayamika called Senator Ofogbu from her hospital bed, her tone laced with smug confidence. "He thinks the surgery is still on," she said, laughter in her voice. "Mama says once it's done, we can start the medication schedule. We just need to decide whether to marry first or wait until after his health declines." The senator's deep baritone replied without hesitation, "After. You don't want to tie yourself legally to a man who might linger too long. Once he's gone, you're free, and we'll have the wedding I promised." Hearing the recording sent a cold, steady rage through Keen. It wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated murder, wrapped in the language of romance and future plans. The senator didn't sound coerced or manipulated. He was a willing architect of the scheme. Now, with both audio and message logs confirming his role, Keen had all the ingredients for a destruction that would be public, undeniable, and permanent. The trick was to keep smiling in front of Kayamika and her mother long enough to ensure they wouldn't suspect a thing. From that day forward, Keen played his role so flawlessly that even Tobe expressed amazement at his composure. He visited Kayamika daily, arriving with gifts, perfume, silk nightgowns, pastries from her favorite bakery, and showered her with a kind of attention that made Madame Rose beam with satisfaction. "You're truly a blessing to my daughter," she would say, clasping his hand. Kayamika responded with affection that looked genuine to anyone watching, leaning into him, resting her head on his shoulder as they talked about wedding venues and guest lists. Keen listened, nodded, and occasionally offered suggestions, all while memorizing the details of their conversations to layer his eventual exposure with maximum precision. At one point, he even staged a romantic hospital dinner, complete with soft lighting, a catered meal, and live violin music in the hallway. Kayamika was visibly touched, telling him, between bites, that she couldn't wait to build a new life together. Keen swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth, replying, "Me neither," with a smile that masked the storm raging inside. The dinner had a purpose beyond appearances. It encouraged Kayamika to feel so secure in her control that she might slip up, share more with the senator, or even brag to her mother about the ease of manipulating him. And it worked. The very next day, she called Madame Rose while Keen was out of the room, but actually listening from the adjoining suite. "It's working, Mama," she said gleefully. "He's so wrapped around my finger, he'll sign anything. I told the senator we might even get him to put the house in my name before the wedding." Madame Rose's laugh in response was low and satisfied. "Good girl. Secure the assets now. The rest will follow." Keen let them talk, recording every word, his heart a drumbeat of grim anticipation. The final act was approaching, and with every passing day, their arrogance made his victory more certain. The hospital's corridors buzzed with activity as the scheduled surgery date drew near. Nurses confirmed pre-op procedures, doctors reviewed consent forms, and Madame Rose was everywhere at once, making sure her future son-in-law had everything he needed. Keen moved through it all like a man in a pleasant daze, thanking people, checking on Kayamika, and even discussing honeymoon destinations as if nothing in the world could disturb him. But in his mind, every step was a countdown, not to surgery, but to the reckoning. The day before the supposed operation, he casually mentioned to Kayamika, that he had moved some of his investments around just in case something happened during recovery. Her eyes sparkled in a way that confirmed his worst suspicions. "That's smart," she said, her tone just a little too pleased. That evening, in the quiet of his home office, Keene met with Ifani and Tobe to finalize the plan. Every recording was organized chronologically, every incriminating clip cued for playback. Ifani had even compiled a short highlight reel for maximum impact, starting with Madame Rose's slowly poison him remark, followed by Kayamika's "I already got a house deed" boast, and ending with the senator's "once he's gone, you're free" statement. Tobe secured a portable speaker with enough volume to fill the hospital lobby. "They won't know what hit them," Tobe said grimly. Before going to bed, Keene sent a message to Kayamika. "I'm so lucky to have you by my side tomorrow." He imagined her smiling as she read it, perhaps forwarding it to the senator with some sly remark. That was fine. Let her think victory was inevitable. Tomorrow, when an entire lobby filled with friends, family, hospital staff, and a few carefully invited media contacts, the illusion she and her mother had built would collapse in a single devastating moment. The surgery would never happen, but the truth would be cut open for all to see. The morning of the supposed surgery dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm Keene had planned. He arrived at the hospital early, impeccably dressed in a tailored Navy suit rather than the hospital gown everyone expected. Kayamika was already in her pre-op room, chatting with Madame Rose and a nurse about post-surgery recovery. When Keene stepped in, his expression was the picture of love and reassurance. "Before we go in," he said softly, "there's something important I want to do." Madame Rose arched an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued, but her suspicion dulled by his calm demeanor. She and Kayamika followed as he led them toward the main lobby, telling them he wanted a moment with family and friends before the operation. What they didn't know was that the lobby was already filled, not just with relatives, but with hospital staff, close friends, and a few discreetly invited reporters. As they entered, a murmur spread through the crowd. Keene moved to the center, gesturing for Kayamika and Madame Rose to stand beside him. "I want to thank everyone for coming today," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Before I undergo something as serious as a kidney donation, I thought it was right to share a few truths, not just about my life, but about the people I trust most." Kayamika smiled nervously, perhaps thinking he was about to deliver a romantic declaration. Madame Rose's face carried the smug composure of someone confident in her position. The air shifted when Keene reached into his pocket and produced a small, sleek speaker. "I want you all to hear this," he said, pressing play. At first, there was only static, and then Madame Rose's unmistakable voice filled the space. "Once he donates the kidney, we'll slowly poison him with the medication so you can marry that senator." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Kayamika's voice followed, laced with laughter. "I already got a house deed in my name." The color drained from her face as whispers erupted among the onlookers. Keene stood perfectly still, watching their expressions shift from confusion to horror, letting the weight of their own words hang in the air like a guillotine poised to drop. Silence held the room for a heartbeat, broken only by the sound of the next clip. Kayamika on the phone with Senator Ofogbu. "He thinks the surgery is still on," she said, smug. "Mama says once it's done, we can start the medication schedule. We just need to decide whether to marry first or wait until after his health declines." The senator's voice came next, rich and damning. "After. You don't want to tie yourself legally to a man who might linger too long. Once he's gone, you're free, and we'll have the wedding I promised." By now, the room was a chorus of shocked gasps and murmurs. Phones lifted to record the unfolding scandal. A nurse clapped a hand over her mouth. An elderly uncle shook his head in disbelief. The reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances, already framing the headlines in their minds. Madame Rose tried to recover first, stepping forward with a forced laugh. This is a joke. He's editing things." But her voice faltered under the weight of too many witnesses and the absolute clarity of the recordings. Kayamika, pale and trembling, grabbed Keene's arm. "Baby, please, I can explain." Her voice cracked, the smooth veneer of confidence gone. Keene pulled his arm away, with quiet finality. Explain how you plotted my death? How you mocked the kidney I was going to give you as if it was a stepping stone to another man's bed. His words cut sharper than any shout could have, carrying through the lobby like a verdict. The whispers in the crowd swelled, a tide of condemnation that neither woman could fight against. Madame Rose's composure crumbled into sputtered protests. Kayamika's eyes darted around, perhaps looking for the senator, perhaps searching for an escape. But Keen wasn't done. I was ready to give my life for you, he said, his voice shaking with controlled fury. Instead, I'll give you the truth for everyone to see. This is the surgery you planned for me. Consider it complete. With that, he stepped back, letting the gathered crowd's disgust and judgment take the place of any further words. The humiliation was total, and there would be no recovery from it. The recordings went viral before Keen even left the hospital. By the time he returned to his office, his phone was buzzing nonstop with calls from journalists, political commentators, and even former associates of the senator. Within hours, the clips were replayed on national television, with captions that left no ambiguity. Senator caught in murder for inheritance plot. Online, hashtags bearing the senator's name alongside words like hashtag kidney plot and hashtag lobby betrayal trended relentlessly. The public's outrage was immediate and unforgiving, fueled by the sheer coldness of the recorded conversations. The senator issued a brief statement through a spokesperson, claiming the audio was taken out of context, but it only made things worse. People began dissecting every word, pointing out how naturally he had spoken about Keen's death. Political opponents pounced, holding press conferences that framed the scandal as proof of the senator's lack of moral fitness for public office. His upcoming campaign events were canceled one by one, and key donors withdrew their support overnight. Investigative journalists dug deeper, unearthing questionable financial dealings and a history of suspiciously timed property acquisitions, some in the names of women linked to him romantically. The murder plot scandal became the entry point for a larger dismantling of his public image, and by week's end, the calls for his resignation were deafening. For Kayamika and Madame Rose, the senator's downfall meant the sudden evaporation of the very future they had schemed for. Without his political clout or financial promise, they were left to face the consequences alone. Friends stopped returning their calls. Neighbors avoided them. Social clubs quietly revoked memberships. And while Keen made no move to press charges, yet the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. He watched it all unfold with a calm detachment, not out of satisfaction for their suffering, but as a man who had finally reclaimed control of a story others had tried to end for him. The real reckoning, however, was still to come. The days following the lobby showdown unfurled like a slow, relentless tide that carried everything false out to sea and left what was real, raw, and unarguable on the sand. The clip of Madame Rose talking about slowly poisoning him played on every screen Keen passed, from airport lounges to roadside kiosks, joined by threads of commentary, think pieces, and reaction videos. Some called the scandal the country's mirror test, a reminder of how charm and pedigree often mask rot. Others focused on the ethics of private hospitals and the ease with which a patient's medication plan could be weaponized if not tightly controlled. In the middle of the noise, Keen chose silence. He turned off most notifications, sent short, courteous declines to interview requests, and showed up at his office at dawn to work through the backlog of contracts he had deferred. Yet every ordinary task felt different, as though the desk, the pen, the glass walls had watched a battle, and now saw him with clearer eyes. He did not feel victorious, so much as spared from a future in which love would have been the cover story for murder. Spared from signing his life away in a hospital gown while the people at his bedside counted down his breaths like a balance sheet. The relief was a clean wind in his chest. The grief, however, was heavier, a grief for the man he had been before he saw what he saw, for the trust that once moved through him like water and now approached life like a locked gate. By midweek, the senator's legal troubles were no longer speculative. A panel from the Anti-Graft Commission announced a formal inquiry into his finances, travel history, and communications with Kayamika and Madame Rose. A magistrate signed a preservation order freezing assets, tied to shell companies that matched payments discussed in the private recordings. A police spokesperson confirmed that both women had been invited to give statements under caution concerning conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm and attempted murder, an invitation that carried the weight of likely arrest. Madame Rose, who had once thrived on being seen, slipped into hiding behind a narrow gate and a dwindling circle of sycophants, who now negotiated their loyalties with panic calculators. Kayamika, in a move that surprised no one who had heard the tapes, returned the engagement ring through her lawyer, with a one-page letter that combined apology, self-pity, and an attempt at legal distance. I was under immense pressure and never intended actual harm. A sentence so threadbare it could not clothe a lie. Keene did not reply. He forwarded the letter to his counsel, added it to a growing evidence binder, and signed instructions to remove her name from any draft document to which Madame Rose had browbeaten him into agreeing. Joint property nominations, insurance beneficiaries, a premature deed transfer quietly waiting in a folder she had once called housekeeping. Every line that had once pointed to Kayamika now pointed to a blank space, a pause between the man he had almost been and the man he now chose to be. At home, the quiet felt honest for the first time in months. His mother visited with food he did not need, but which he accepted anyway, because the ritual of being mothered returned him to a simpler architecture of love. Tobe, who had witnessed the planning and the tearing down, sat with him on the balcony some nights, saying little. The city spread below them with its untidy constellations of light. Somewhere in that sprawl was the hospital lobby where truth had found a microphone and walked on its own 2 feet. "I keep thinking about the clause," Keene said one evening. The clause in his father's will that had seemed like a benevolent nudge and turned into a noose for opportunists. He wanted to be settled. And look what the idea of a deadline attracted. Tobe shrugged. Deadlines don't build character. They just speed up the reveal. The line stayed with Keene. The end-of-year date was still coming, indifferent to scandal. He met with his lawyer and did something his father might or might not have predicted. He elected not to marry to save the money. He let the clause trigger. A significant portion of his inheritance would move to the Abedijk Foundation for public housing, and he authorized an additional private donation that surprised even his legal team. "It's not punishment," he said. "It's alignment." And for the first time since the garden corridor, the tightness in his chest eased, not because the world was kind, but because he had decided to be. The idea for the Kidney Foundation arrived not as a grand vision, but as a human voice. A nurse from Renal Ward 3B, who had pressed her palm to her mouth the day the recordings played and later sent a simple message through the hospital's patient liaison. "If he ever wants to help, we have people who can't even afford the tests." Keene asked for numbers. The figures were a ledger of quiet emergencies, diagnostic apps that delayed treatment until hope had to negotiate with mathematics, families selling land to buy weeks, dialysis skipped because the bus fare to the city took food off the table. He created the Abedijk Renal Trust with a mandate that was both simple and ferociously practical. Fund screenings, subsidize dialysis, underwrite donor compatibility testing, and pay for post-transplant medication for recipients and donors, because survival is a story with chapters, and medicine only writes the first page. He insisted on 2 governance rules that came from the wound he carried: independent pharmacy audits and medication custody protocols that required dual signatures for any high-risk regimen. "Trust is a beautiful thing," he told the board at its inaugural meeting, "and also a system." The hospital that had once been the stage for his humiliation became the pilot site for his reforms. The same corridor that had carried betrayal now heard the soft click of new policy doors closing on old loopholes. He visited the ward quietly at first, not with cameras, but with clipboards and time. He listened to a mechanic who had lost count of the days he'd chosen breath mints over breakfast, so his daughter wouldn't smell the hunger. He met a literature teacher whose students now practice silence because the dialysis machine did not respect school bells. He sat with a girl of 19 who kept a notebook of questions that would shame a medical panel. How many milliliters of water is a mango? Because compliance is a language most people are never taught. He funded not only treatment, but logistics, transport stipends, work leniency agreements negotiated with employers, child care credits for mothers who could not both heal and parent without splitting in 2. The nurse who had first written became a program coordinator. The young resident who argued for stricter anti-tamper seals on medication carts got them, and a research grant to track outcomes. None of it returned what had been taken from him. All of it returned him to himself. "You're here a lot," the nurse said once, not as a question, but as recognition. He looked around at the beeping, the breathing, the arithmetic of second chances. "So are they," he answered. On a late afternoon rimmed with harmattan gold, he walked the hospital garden corridor alone, the same path where a mother had once measured his life in pills and plans. The plants looked more ordinary in daylight, less like witnesses, more like green facts. He stopped at the bend, placed his hand on the cool rail, and exhaled. He did not rehearse a speech or invent a moral. He simply stood in the place where he had chosen clarity over spectacle and allowed the body he had almost risked for a lie to feel entirely his again. His phone buzzed, a text from his lawyer confirming the housing fund's transfer. Another from the trust's manager saying the first batch of medication cards had reached families on the outskirts of Msuka. A third from Tobe, terse as always. "Dinner? No speeches." He smiled. When he turned to go, the lobby doors slid open and a stream of ordinary life spilled out, orderlies laughing, a grandmother arguing gently with a cashier, a boy balancing a gift bag too big for his arms. He moved through them, not as a man who had won, but as a man who had refused to lose himself. Outside, the city opened like a clean page. He stepped into it without hurry, carrying no ring, no grudge, and no need to prove anything to the ghosts of plans that failed. The gift he had almost given to death had become a promise to the living, and in keeping it, he understood something his father's claws had fumbled toward clumsily. Beginnings worth having are not purchased with deadlines, but protected with choices. He made one more. He went home, not to start over, but to continue, which is what survival looks like when it remembers its own name. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.